Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra. This week we have the second of our Roadshow episodes. From time to time when attending academic conferences, we like to do mini-interviews with people we're chatting to give you something of the flavour of these events, but also so student and early career listeners can get a sense of the range of backgrounds and career paths that can lead to a career in international law. So recently, I was at the American branch of the International Law Association's International Law Weekend in New York, followed by the annual Lieber Institute workshop in upstate New York at the US Military Academy at West Point on the beautiful Hudson River. I'll let our guests introduce themselves, but will remind you that they are speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing they say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. Oh, and do bear with us. The quality of sound recording out there in the field can be variable, and as a result, if you stick around to the end, there may even be something of a blooper reel. With that, let's get underway. Thank you for joining us on Called to the Bar. Could you introduce yourself and your institutional affiliation briefly?
Hi, I'm Chris Carpenter, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge.
Terrific. And Chris, how did you get into international law? What were you doing until you started your PhD?
So I got into international law mainly through doing a master's at Cambridge in politics and international studies. I did research with a professor at the Lieber Center and immediately fell in love and thought, gosh, wouldn't this be an exciting thing to do with my life? Went to law school in the US to get a JD and spent 3 years practicing international arbitration at a corporate firm based in Philly and New York, and just now have made the transition back into an academic setting to do the PhD.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, quite a few of us on the Call to the Bar team have some experience with the Lauder Center. It really is a kind of magical place to get involved in international law, and I can understand why you'd want to be back in Cambridge. So what are you working on? What's the PhD about?
So the PhD is actually on digital surveillance and data protection in femtech, which is the female technology industry, so fertility tracking apps and things like that.
Yes, certainly a very germane topic given the state of US politics at the moment. And obviously the world's a pretty challenging place for international lawyers at present. What do you do to take your mind off international law? What do you do or read or view or listen to?
Oh man, I really like going outside. I find that if I can be surrounded by trees where there is fresh air, I'm maybe 30% happier than whatever I was before I was doing that. I also love coffee and I love reading, so if you put those things in the same place, I tend to be pretty content.
Right. In a park with a coffee, reading. Again, I think there'd be a lot of sympathy for that in the Call to the Bar team. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Martins, thank you for joining us on Call to the Bar. Can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Paparinskis. I'm a professor of public international law at UCL, and I'm a member of the International Law Commission.
And in both capacities, we're grateful to have you here, and I hope we're going to be audible over the music in the background, but for a podcast entitled Call to the Bar, hopefully that's only appropriate. Martins, how did you get into international law? What was your career path to your present posts?
When I was an undergraduate at the University of Latvia, I did the Jessup International Law Multicourt competition, and that, I think, excited me about international law. And then it's really one thing led to another. I went to Oxford to do my master's, and I stayed on to do a doctorate degree, and then I just continued doing that.
Right, terrific. And yes, I mean, Jessup's been a large part of the background to a number of these conversations. But what are you working on at the moment?
I'm working on law state responsibility, a very, very classic topic, but within the International Law Commission, I'm trying to see whether more could be done, and not at all to the slightest extent pushing back at the great Australian Professor Crawford, whether a slight wrinkle could be added on compensation in relation to state responsibility under the auspices of the Commission.
State responsibility for internationally wrongful acts and compensation for internationally wrongful acts would obviously be a topical issue in the world as it stands. But So, the world is full of international law and much of it's a bit grim at the moment. What do you do to take your mind off international law in what presumably very little spare time you have?
It's a great question. I think my mind veers in two directions. If I want to go a bit more highbrow, I go to some of the special exhibitions in one of the great London museums. If a bit lowbrow, then just rewatching some of the classic, silly 1990s sitcoms.
Fantastic. Martins, thank you very much for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
Okay, Monique, thanks for joining us on Call to the Bar. Could you introduce yourself and your institutional affiliation briefly, please?
Yeah, sure. My name is Monique Cormier and I am a senior lecturer at Monash Faculty of Law in Melbourne.
Excellent. And Monique, what are you working on at the moment?
So a few different things, but what I am specifically working on at the moment is a piece about the legal implications of AUKUS and specifically about the potential nuclear non-proliferation implications of Australia getting nuclear-powered submarines.
Very interesting and very topical. Actually, the first question we normally ask people in these Vox Pops, but jet lag and my brain kind of failing to work for me, is how did you get into international law? What kind of career path brought you to your present job?
Well, that's interesting. So I've always been interested in international. I had a sort of an international childhood. I grew up in Saudi Arabia and travelled quite a bit, and then I kind of fell into law by accident. And did international relations at the same time, which I really liked. And it wasn't until I started doing international law electives that I'm like, oh, okay, I really like this. And from there, kind of fell into academia 10 years later, mostly because there were no other jobs available and I needed to, and my sort of honours supervisor, who I did a thesis in international law, she said, well, you can come and teach. And this was at Adelaide University. And I thought, no way, I could never ever teach. That's just not an option. And she said, well, what other options do you have right now? And I said, okay, fair enough. And so started teaching, and I really enjoyed that, and kind of went from there in terms of, a career in academia. But yeah, moved.
Well, the world's a difficult and challenging place for international lawyers at the moment. What do you do to take your mind off international law in terms of, hobbies or listening or reading or viewing?
So something I've just started doing maybe about 18 months ago is refinishing furniture. And so that's something that yeah. So most of the kind of old, crappy, secondhand wooden furniture in my house has now had a full makeover, and I'm at the point of finding things that have been put out on the street and making them, doing them over. And it takes ages, and it's quite expensive, and I would never sell them because I wouldn't make any money back, but it's something that I just enjoy doing.
Oh, that's really terrific. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Jay, thanks for joining us. Can I start by asking you to introduce yourself and your institution?
Yeah, I'm Jay Batonbacal. I'm a professor at the University of the Philippines and director of its Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. I'm also holding concurrently the position of executive director of the Graduate Studies program of the law school.
Terrific. And what career path brought you into international law and led to your present job?
Well, actually, it's you could say it's the influence of my mentor back in law school. We need to do a graduate paper as part of our requirements, and he steered me towards writing a paper on the oceans. And I ended up doing a paper on coastal zone management. And then after I submitted that paper, he sort of kept in touch with me, and eventually connected me with some people from Canada who were at the time doing a project on oceans management. And that led me to apply to their marine affairs program, specifically on studying aspects of the law of the sea, because at the time, this was the 1990s, the Law of the Sea Convention was about to enter into force. So he thought, my mentor thought that we needed to develop people to develop the expertise in this field.
Really interesting. Yeah, one of the things we find in these conversations is there's no one way into international law, and it's often those unexpected connections.
Yes.
And what are you working on at the moment?
Well, at the moment, quite a lot, actually. We do a lot of work on the South China Sea issues because of the maritime disputes between the Philippines and China. We do a lot of capacity building as well for the government on anything related to oceans management. It's mainly capacity building on oceans law. The law of the sea particularly is of great interest now to the Philippines due to the flare-up in the disputes, and also the fact that there's now this acceptance that the country is a maritime and archipelagic nation. And so the government is pushing so many projects to try to enhance capacities and capabilities relating to the oceans.
Great. And in all the spare time you don't have, what do you do, if anything, to take your mind off international law?
Yeah, that's a good question. I sometimes ask myself what else I should be doing. But lately, it's still related to my studies because I decided to try to diversify my teaching methods. So I went into gaming, board gaming. So part of it is trying to develop methodologies for using board games in school. So right now I've been experimenting with using it for teaching law of the sea, natural resources law, even property law. So more or less that happens to be also my spare time, trying to play with these games, and also probably due to the adaptation that we've had to undertake due to the COVID pandemic. I'm now looking as well into artificial intelligence and trying to see how we can incorporate that into the hybrid teaching methodologies that the university is trying to promote in the post-pandemic world.
Fascinating. Jay, thanks so much for your time.
Welcome, and pleased to be here.
Emily, thanks for joining us. There'll be probably the background noise of people on a bus being ferried to a conference at West Point, but I can explain that context later. Could you introduce yourself and your institution?
Sure, Emily Crawford. I'm a professor at the University of Sydney Law School.
Terrific. And what career path brought you to that job? How did you get into international law?
Honestly, it was entirely accidental. I was doing my law degree and it came time to choose some electives, and it partially kind of fit my timetable, and it wasn't corporate law, and then accidentally turned out to completely love it. It was suddenly like realizing how the world works, and so that's how I decided to make that my life's work, basically.
Terrific. Yeah, a lot of these interviews involve people rejecting corporate law in one form or another. And what are you working on at the moment?
So at the moment, I'm continuing the project that I've got with Jackie Mowbray at Sydney, with Jesse Homan at UTS, and Daniel Joyce at UNSW. So we did an exhibition about the souvenirs of international law. We're now moving on to the next stage, which is that we're planning to do a pop-up cocktail bar, which is going to recreate cocktails that were served during the 1950s at the United Nations Delegates Dining Room. And we're going to use that as a way to look at how international law basically gets formed in all of these different ways. So we have this idea of what it must have been like to be in the Delegates Dining Room in the 50s negotiating treaties or negotiating agreements.
Mad Men at the UN, and a very appropriate anecdote for a podcast called Call to the Bar. And so in whatever spare time you do or don't have, what do you do to take your mind off international law?
So my two diversions are gaming and craft. So I have an Xbox and a PS4, and so I've been known to engage in some Fallout or some Red Dead Redemption, and I also do things like needlepoint and origami. So it's some weird kind of diversionary things that just I find use different parts of your brain.
Terrific. Thanks so much for joining us. Craig, thanks for joining us. Before we get into it, the listeners will have just heard me speaking with Emily Crawford on a bus, which I said I'd explain a little. It's not a big explanation. It was just that to get from the hotel at the West Point conference to the library at the West Point Military Academy, we had to move as a group under supervision from someone in uniform or with a DoD pass to get through security. And it's a very big campus. So that explains the bus sounds last time. But anyway, I'm now really pleased to be joined by Craig Martin of the fabulous Jib Jab podcast. And the amusing thing about this is we're actually doing it not live in the field, but over Zoom after the fact, because Craig, you were in fact my first interview on my academic road trip. And we attempted that interview on a rooftop bar in New York, aptly called PhD Terrace. And for reasons listeners will hear later, that was not an entirely successful interview from an acoustic point of view. But anyway, Craig, could you introduce yourself and your institutional affiliation?
Sure. So, and thanks for having me. And it was unfortunate that the first recording in the margins of the ABILA conference didn't work out. But yes, my name is Craig Martin. I am a professor of law at Washburn University School of Law, which is actually in Topeka, Kansas, although I run a program in Washington, D.C.
Terrific. And Craig, what career path brought you to your present job?
So it's pretty long and circuitous. I'll try to keep it short, but there is a sort of a through line that runs through, or a theme that runs through the entire winding road. It really began when I was a student or a cadet at the Collège Militaire Royal and the Royal Military College of Canada, where I did military history and diplomatic history and IR, and so got bitten by the bug of international relations. And then after graduation, serving as a naval officer, I spent about 4 or 5 months seconded to the Canadian mission to the United Nations in New York for the General Assembly. And it was right around the time when the Berlin Wall was falling, the Soviet Union was collapsing. I'm dating myself. But that, again, sort of really got me infected with the bug of international relations, international diplomacy, and even international law. And so following my release from the Navy, I went to Japan to grad school on a scholarship to study, and ended up in the Faculty of Law of all places, although I was doing what I thought was a master's in history. And I ended up writing a dissertation on Japan's special interests in Manchuria. So there was an agreement between the United States and Japan regarding Japan's so-called special interests in Manchuria, which required me to delve into international law. And so while I was doing this and pondering whether I should do a PhD or something else, I thought, well, I really should go to law school and study international law more rigorously. And so I went back to Canada, to the University of Toronto, did law school and did a lot of courses in the international law realm. Then I sort of had a diversion. I went into practice and was a corporate commercial litigation lawyer in Toronto for several years before I sort of woke up and decided, wait, I wanted to do international law, and so I went down to the States, to University of Pennsylvania, to do an SJD, and there I did a dissertation that sort of brought in my work in Japan, international law, and international security, and then sort of went on to the market and became an academic, first at the University of Baltimore as a VAP, as what it's called in the United States. And then at Washburn, where I teach a slew of international law-related courses, including the law of armed conflict and climate change.
Terrific. No, I mean, that's a very interesting background. But I note a common feature in many of these interviews is the sort of brief and unhappy detour into commercial law. But
well, I wouldn't say it was so entirely unhappy. I mean, I learned a lot. It was exciting for the time. But yes, I sort of, as I said, I woke up and thought, wait, like, this isn't entirely why I went to law school.
Right. Yeah. Look, and I occasionally talk about the 13 months I spent in the commercial practice of law, and I always call it 13 months, not a year, which perhaps indicates something. But I certainly learned a lot about legal drafting, and even more than law school had taught me about attention to detail and the necessity of kind of getting, all of the relevant documents related to a matter together and in chronological order and going through them closely. So yeah, there were fundamental skills there that was certainly worthwhile. Anyway, Craig, what are you working on at the moment?
So I'm finishing up one project which relates to climate change. It's where, I have a co-author at the University of Pennsylvania. We're looking at geoengineering and more particularly solar radiation management, and the extent to which efforts by some countries to engage in unilateral solar radiation management may, in fact, pose a threat to national security to other states and bring about the possibility of armed conflict. And we look at the way in which that sort of unilateral deployment of solar radiation management is not sufficiently governed by either the international climate change law regime or any other regime, frankly. And at the same time, the possibility of a use of force against that kind of climate rogue state is also not going to be necessarily restrained or constrained by the jus ad bellum regime, which is has been increasingly weakened in the last 2 decades. So that's one project. The other is really more in the realm of AI and the law of armed conflict. So I'm looking at autonomous weapon systems and the extent to which they may or may not comply with IHL, and whether IHL and in particular the Geneva Conventions need to be revised or amended or adjusted in some fashion, in particular to control or govern the extent to which autonomous weapon systems would comply with the principles of proportionality and precautions in attack.
Both regrettably very topical issues.
Regrettably, yes.
Yeah. And Craig, what do you do to take your mind off international law?
Well, these days, I have to say, there's not a lot of time, but I guess a few things which sound rather geeky is I play a lot of online chess for fun, and I'm sort of a serious photographer. So when I have the chance, I do I try to travel and do photography. So those are a couple of things. I work out, although I don't really consider that fun, but it does take my mind off things.
Yeah, well, I don't think any hobby counts as geeky on Call to the Bar in terms of the range of responses we've had over time. But Craig, thanks so much for joining us. And in a moment, listeners will get to hear the original version of this interview.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. Thanks for having me, and congrats again on a wonderful podcast.
Well, thanks so much, Craig. Okay, cheers. Bye.
We have this soundtrack in the background. It's too funny.
I think the soundtrack will be a bit in the background. Okay, we'll do our best. All right, so Craig, thank you for joining Call to the Bar. Atmospherically enough, we're at a bar that may be audible in the background called PhD Terrace.
Indeed.
In Midtown Manhattan. But Craig, could you begin by introducing yourself, your full name and where you work?
Sure. So my name is Craig Martin, and I'm at Washburn University School of Law in Kansas, although I'm actually based in Washington, D.C.
And also the host of the excellent Jib Jab podcast, which is one of the inspirations for Call to the Bar.
Wow, thank you. I'm glad to be an inspiration.
But our 3 traditional questions for these roadshow interviews are, what career path led you to your present job in international law? How did you get into international law?
So it's probably a long tale, but the short version is really I was actually in the Navy. I was a naval officer, and I served for about 5 months as a naval attaché at the United Nations in the Canadian mission. And immediately after that, I left the Navy and went to study grad school in Japan. And for my thesis, doing a master's there, I was looking at Japan's special interest in Manchuria and an agreement, a very arcane agreement between the United States and Japan over Japan's special interest in Manchuria, which involved a lot of international law. I'd already become interested in international law, working at the UN, found myself grappling with international law issues, even though I was not trained as a lawyer. And so I decided that after my master's in Japan, I should go to law school. And so I went back to Canada, went to law school, and sort of focused on international law. And then after a far too long segue in practicing law in Toronto, I decided to go back to school yet again to do an SJD and really focus on international and comparative law, and found myself in the academy.
Terrific. And Craig, what are you working on now?
So I'm working on really climate change, issues around climate change at the intersection of climate change and security. And so at the moment I'm working on a project that's looking at geoengineering, and in particular solar radiation modification, and the threat that it poses for national and international peace and security.
Terrific. And when you're not focusing on these questions of international law, what do you do to take your mind off international law, other than producing, editing, and being the lead interviewer on one of the more listened to podcasts in the field?
So I have a few different hobbies, although I frankly think I don't spend nearly enough time on them these days, but photography is one. It's sort of a serious photographer, and probably spend far too much time playing online chess.
Right.
So I'll leave it at that.
Right. Well, set you up with a game with my son with online chess at some point. But, yeah.
There we go.
Okay. Craig, thanks for joining us on Call to the Bar.
Well, thank you for having me.